All right, let's dive into a true horror classic,
Mhm.
a story that still freaks people out even decades later. Stephen King's Carrie. You've sent over some great articles, plus your own notes, and wow, I'm ready to unpack all of this. Looks like you're really interested in the different adaptations of Carrie out there, how certain themes evolved over time, and the lasting impact it's had on horror, on pop culture, you name it. Ready to go.
Absolutely. It never ceases to amaze me just how Carrie manages to tap into those primal fears we all have, especially, those awkward teenage years.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's rewind to the beginning, back to 1974, when King's debut novel, Carrie, hit the shelves.
Mm.
And boom, instant bestseller. The story's all about Carrie White, this high school student who, let's face it, has a truly horrific adolescence. So for anyone who hasn't experienced Carrie yet, can you give us the quick rundown of what she's dealing with?
Well, Carrie's constantly bullied by her classmates, but it goes beyond typical high school drama. There's real cruelty at play. And then, to make things worse, she goes home to her mother, Margaret, who's incredibly religious and controlling. Margaret sees Carrie's emerging telekinetic abilities, moving things with her mind, as something evil. So poor Carrie is stuck between these two worlds, both incredibly isolating and painful.
Sounds like King zeroed in on those universal fears of not fitting in, being misunderstood.
Yeah.
But then he cranked things up with the supernatural elements.
Exactly. He created a story that's relatable and terrifying at the same time, blending the everyday horrors of high school with this potential for extraordinary and, in this case, destructive power. That's what makes Carrie such a gripping read.
Absolutely gripping. Speaking of gripping, let's shift gears to the 1976 film adaptation, the one directed by Brian De Palma, which, most people consider the definitive version. Many would say that De Palma really nailed the essence of King's novel. But instead of just saying that, can we break down why this adaptation clicks so well with audiences?
Well, a few things come to mind. De Palma understood the power of visual storytelling. He used techniques like split screen and slow motion to amp up the suspense and create this almost dreamlike, unsettling atmosphere. He also managed to get incredible performances from Sissy Spacek as Carrie and Piper Laurie as her mother. Both even got Oscar nominations, which is pretty rare for horror films.
That's saying something. And then there's the prom scene. It's legendary. It's become a symbol of high school horror, that ultimate fear of humiliation just played out in a huge, bloody way.
Why do you think that scene in particular has had such a lasting impact?
I think it's how De Palma builds up the tension. He walks you through Carrie's humiliation and rage before she finally lets loose with her telekinetic powers. The pig's blood, the flickering lights, that slow-motion chaos. It's a masterful blend of visual horror and emotional catharsis. It's horrifying, yet strangely satisfying to watch Carrie fight back against her tormentors. It's interesting you say satisfying, because on one hand, you see this girl who's been abused and pushed to her breaking point, and you almost want her to, unleash that fury. But then you have the devastating consequences, the sheer destruction.
Exactly. It plays into that theme of revenge that runs through the whole Carrie franchise, that desire for payback, but also the consequences for both the victim and everyone around them. The prom scene, probably more than any other moment in the film, embodies that duality.
The 1976 film was a tough act to follow. But the Carrie story didn't end there, did it? There were sequels, a made-for-TV movie, and a remake. So let's explore how these later interpretations built on, or maybe even challenged, what the original film established.
Yeah, you're right. The story didn't end there. In 1999, we had The Rage, Carrie 2. It went in a slightly different direction, focusing on Rachel Lang, who we find out is Carrie's half-sister. And of course, she also has telekinetic powers.
So not a direct sequel, but more like exploring a different corner of King's world, maybe trying to appeal to a different audience.
I think the filmmakers were trying to modernize the story. The setting, the bullying, it all felt more current, reflecting how those dynamics had changed since the original film. There's also a bigger emphasis on inherited trauma. Rachel struggling with her family's dark past and the powers that seem to be a part of her lineage.
It sounds like The Rage was trying to say something new, but did it actually stand on its own? Or was it stuck in the shadow of the first Carrie film?
I mean, it had its own strengths. It tried to delve into the psychological impact of telekinesis and how those powers can be both a gift and a curse. But for many, it didn't have the same raw emotional power, the visceral horror that made the 1976 Carrie such a hit.
I get that. Now, this next one is interesting to me. In 2002, there was a Carrie TV movie, which was actually supposed to be a pilot for a series. Man, a Carrie TV series. Can you imagine? So, what direction did this adaptation take?
Well, they tried to stay pretty close to the original novel. They even give Carrie a slightly happier ending. She actually survives the prom.
Oh, well, a happier ending. That's a pretty big change from the book and the De Palma film. Did that change the tone or the message of the story at all?
Definitely shifted the focus. The horror elements were still there, but the emphasis seemed to be more on Carrie's internal struggles, her journey towards self-acceptance, and her attempts to control her powers. It's too bad the series never took off. It would have been fascinating to see how they developed those themes over multiple episodes.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder. But let's move on to the most recent adaptation. The 2013 remake with Chloe Grace Moretz as Carrie and Julianne Moore as her mother. This one felt like a more modern take on the story. So how did they approach the source material?
Well, the 2013 remake brought in cyberbullying, which makes sense given how technology has changed the nature of cruelty. It wasn't just physical and verbal abuse anymore. It was about the ways social media can be used to humiliate and isolate someone. The film also dug into Carrie's psychological state, her anxieties, her longing for connection.
Chloe Grace Moretz is known for playing characters with a certain vulnerability, so I can see her bringing a unique depth to Carrie. And Julianne Moore's, she's always incredible at playing characters with these complex inner lives. So it's no surprise that she gave a chilling performance as Margaret White.
Yeah, the performances were strong. However, the remake got, well, mixed reviews. Some critics felt it didn't really bring anything new to the table. Others appreciated the attempt to update the themes for a modern audience. It's always tricky to remake a classic, especially one as beloved and culturally significant as Carrie.
It shows you how certain stories resonate so deeply that they become part of our cultural DNA. Reimagining those stories can be risky, but it also gives us a chance to revisit those themes and see them in a new light. But before we jump into that, I want to take a closer look at the core themes that run through the whole Carrie franchise. I think that's where the true power of this story lies.
You're absolutely right. Beyond the blood and the special effects, Carrie explores some really profound themes that, still resonate with us today. Perhaps the most obvious one is bullying, which is shown in all its ugliness throughout the franchise.
It's more than just kids being kids, right? Carrie forces us to look at the systematic cruelty that can exist within social structures, whether it's a high school or a family or even a whole community.
Exactly. And each adaptation of Carrie shows how our understanding of bullying has evolved. In the 1976 film, it's very much about physical and social isolation, that almost like primal pack mentality. But by the time we get to the 2013 remake, the focus shifts to cyberbullying, which adds a whole other layer of insidiousness. It shows how technology can amplify those feelings of shame and isolation, making the abuse even more pervasive and damaging.
And the Carrie franchise doesn't shy away from exploring the devastating consequences of bullying, both for the victim and for those who participate in it. But there's also the theme of revenge, that almost inevitable response to prolonged abuse. Carrie's telekinetic powers become this incredibly potent symbol of her rage and her desire to fight back.
And it's interesting how that revenge fantasy plays out differently in each adaptation. In the 1976 film, there's a sense of almost operatic tragedy, a cathartic release of power that ultimately consumes everyone. But the later adaptations, particularly the TV movie, seem to grapple with the idea of whether there's a way to break that cycle of violence, to find some kind of redemption.
It's like we're wrestling with the question of whether violence, even when it feels justified, can ever truly bring peace or healing. And speaking of complex dynamics, we can't talk about Carrie without addressing the role of religious extremism, particularly as embodied by Carrie's mother, Margaret.
Margaret White is such a fascinating and terrifying character. She represents a kind of rigid, fundamentalist belief system that just can't accommodate anything outside of its narrow worldview. And because she sees Carrie's powers as demonic, her response is not one of love and support, but of fear and punishment.
It's interesting how Margaret's religious extremism almost mirrors the kind of social isolation that Carrie experiences at school. She's ostracized for being different, for not conforming to the norms, both at home and in her community.
And that brings us to another central theme of the Carrie franchise, that feeling of adolescent alienation, of not belonging, of being an outsider. It's a theme that transcends time and
It's
place.
a universal experience, isn't it? That feeling of not quite fitting in, especially during those crazy teenage years. And Carrie takes it to an extreme, showing how those feelings of isolation and rejection can be amplified when you're also dealing with, with extraordinary abilities that you don't understand.
And those abilities, Carrie's telekinesis, add another layer to the theme of power and control. On one hand, her powers give her a sense of agency, a way to finally fight back against those who have hurt her. But on the other hand, they represent a force that she can't fully control, a force that ultimately leads to destruction and chaos.
There's a real cautionary tale there, right? It's about the dangers of unchecked power, but also about uh, the responsibility that comes with having extraordinary abilities, whether those abilities are, literal, like Carrie's telekinesis, or metaphorical, like the power we all have to influence and affect the lives of others.
That's a really insightful point. The Carrie franchise forces us to confront not only the ways in which power can be abused, but also the consequences of our actions, even when those actions are driven by pain and a desire for justice.
So we've talked about the evolution of the Carrie franchise through its various adaptations, and we've delved into the complex themes that make this story so enduring. But I'd love to get your perspective on the legacy of Carrie. What impact has this story had on horror, on pop culture, and even on our broader understanding of human nature?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Carrie had a huge impact on horror, particularly in terms of paving the way for more stories about female rage and empowerment. Before Carrie, horror films rarely explored female characters with such depth and complexity. They were often either victims or villains, but Carrie was different. She was both vulnerable and powerful, sympathetic and terrifying.
Yeah, she was a complex character for sure, a host speaker. It's interesting how the prom scene, probably the most iconic moment in the whole franchise, has been it's been both praised and criticized for how it shows female rage. Some see it as this powerful act of rebellion against oppression, while others worry that it just reinforces that stereotype of women being, emotionally unstable and dangerous.
It really shows how powerful the story is, that it can spark such different interpretations.
Right.
And it speaks to the complex ways women are often portrayed in media.
Right.
But beyond its impact on horror, Carrie has also become part of pop culture. The prom scene especially has become this touchstone. It's referenced and parodied in tons of films, TV shows, even commercials. That image of Carrie covered in blood, her eyes blazing with telekinetic power, has become a symbol for a kind of, well, righteous fury, even if it's terrifying.
Yeah, you're right. It's like one of those images that takes on a life of its own beyond the original story. You don't even need to have seen Carrie to get the symbolism, that feeling of being pushed too far and finally snapping. Which brings me to a question for you.
hmm
What do you think it is about Carrie that still resonates with audiences after all these years? Why do we keep coming back to this story, retelling it, reimagining it, and finding new ways to engage with its themes?
Hmm, that's a great question. I think there are a few reasons. On a basic level, Carrie is a classic underdog story. Someone who's been marginalized and abused, finding a way to fight back. There's something, I don't know, cathartic about watching her unleash that power, even if it leads to tragedy.
Yeah, it's like we're all cheering for her, even though we know it's not going to end well. But there's something deeper going on too, right? Carrie isn't just a revenge fantasy. It's about our own fears and anxieties, about the darker side of human nature that we try to ignore but can't really escape.
Exactly. Carrie makes us confront the uncomfortable realities of bullying, social isolation, and how seemingly normal people can take part in acts of cruelty. And it reminds us that those who are different, those who don't fit in, are often the most vulnerable.
That's true. It's interesting how each version of Carrie reflects the anxieties of its time. The original film tapped into the social and cultural changes of the 1970s, while the later adaptations explored more modern issues like cyberbullying and the impact of technology in our lives.
That's what makes Carrie so timeless. The details might change, but those themes of fear, rejection, the struggle for acceptance, those are universal.
They really are.
Mhm.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the beginning with Stephen King's novel to the different film adaptations and all the complex themes that make this story so captivating. Before we wrap up, I'm curious about your thoughts on the future of the Carrie franchise. Do you think there's still more to explore with this story? Could a future adaptation reimagine Carrie for a new generation while still staying true to that core message?
Absolutely. I think there's so much potential for new interpretations of Carrie. Imagine a modern adaptation that really digs into Carrie's mind, exploring her telekinesis as a metaphor for, for the hidden potential we all have inside us, or maybe a story that switches things up, focusing on one of the bullies and how they come to terms with the consequences of their actions.
Those are great ideas. It's pretty amazing that a story written almost 50 years ago can still spark new conversations and creative interpretations. It shows how powerful King's original vision was, but also how relevant those themes still are today.
And maybe that's the real legacy of Carrie. It's a story that keeps challenging us, makes us think about the complexities of being human, and the responsibility we all have to create a world where empathy and compassion win out.
Well said. It's been an awesome deep dive, and I want to thank you for sharing your insights with me. And of course, a huge thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this journey. We hope this has given you a deeper understanding of the Carrie franchise and maybe spark some new ideas to think about. And remember, there are always more deep dives to explore, more fascinating stories to unravel. So until next time, happy listening.